And so we've reached the end of my Five Nights at Freddy's Grand Prix. In it, I've turned animatronics from the games into zombies, into Marvel and DC superheroes and villains, and now I'm ending it the same way I ended my Pokemon Grand Prix, turning the characters into Godzilla monsters. But just because this is the end of the Grand Prix doesn't mean it's the end of me using FNAF animatronics in videos. I may very well do a sequel to this video or any of the other ones in the Grand Prix, so let me know in the comments which one you'd like to see a sequel to the most. And subscribe if you're new here and you want to make sure to see my future FNAF videos. But for now, let's see how they translate into Titans, shall we? Let's go!
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show.
With its two alpha titans, Godzilla and Kong, both in recovery from previous battles, Dimension K005 is in serious trouble. More new titans have been rearing their ugly mugs faster than the organization I'm working with, Monarch, can turn around. Like we've seen from the last few to show up, the new ones also seem pretty eager to have their big brawls for territory in major cities, causing plenty of destruction and deaths. It's getting to a point where world governments are considering evacuating people out of every major city in the world just in case. It's pretty drastic, but I can't say I blame them for thinking that way. Weirdly enough, two of the new titans to show up appeared in Utah and resembled some kaiju that were wreaking havoc back in my world's Utah. Except these ones were a lot more vicious. The first one to stomp its way into Salt Lake City was like a 300-foot tall humanoid fox with a burning molten core. Looked similar to a kaiju back in my world called Grim Foxy, so I just started calling this one Burning Grim Foxy. One of the Monarch guys, Rick Stanton, said since it was a Fire Fox Titan, we should call it Mozilla. I thought it was pretty funny and gave him a laugh, but everyone else kinda just ignored him. Anyway, on one arm the thing had a huge hooked claw for a hand, and one of its eyes was blacked out, while the other was glowing orange and would drip with magma or something. Since there weren't any Alpha Titans left to fight this thing, the military came in and tried to handle it. And their weapons seemed like they were doing some damage at first, punching holes in the thing's flesh. But the fox just didn't seem to care. Through the holes it wouldn't bleed or nothing, it would just leak more fire and magma, dripping onto the streets and melting stuff. When the military kept coming at it, the thing seemed to start smashing up things like it was doing it out of spite, breathing cannons of fire at the biggest buildings and smashing its massive hook through towers. Figured it was only a matter of time before another Titan showed up to fight it, and the two started busting up the city even worse. So I thought the least I could do is try to get a kaiju in there that we could actually trust. And I knew just where to find it. This young hunter named Greg had tamed this big bear kaiju, and together taken out the kaiju that were wreaking havoc in Utah back in our world for a while. Plus, he often worked with this kaiju researcher that I figured would be pretty interested to hear about variants of kaiju from our world showing up somewhere else. He was prolific in the kaiju hunting world for coming up with tons of theories about where different kaiju were coming from and how to beat some of the tougher ones. The theories didn't always pan out, but when they did, they were seriously helpful. And apparently it was good I didn't ask him any later, because he just announced his upcoming retirement.
Now, some of you may recall that I actually have done one FNAF kaiju drawing before in my episode of turning FNAF animatronics into a whole bunch of different monsters. So I had some pre-established lore that I figured I had to work into this, even though that was set in Heath's actual world, and this one is set in the Godzilla world, but that actually kinda worked with where I left off with the Pokemon Godzilla Monsters episode, because I mentioned that Heath was considering going back to his world to bring a kaiju from there over here to help fight, so that actually played into this pretty well. But now for the design of this one and the drawing in general, I was really excited to play more with destruction like I did in the last Pokemon Godzilla Monsters episode, and with this one, the last drawing I did was the Mega Metagross one, where the destruction was kind of passive, like he was flying past a building and just happened to hit it with his hand. With this one, I wanted to do an active, on-purpose destruction, and I thought of it like this Grim Foxy here Titan doing a show of intimidation, like smashing a building behind him, and I really liked the pose that I came up with for it, and I think the destruction does look pretty cool. I think the Metagross one, the building destruction, I used a similar method as I did here. I think it looked a little bit more refined in the Metagross drawing, but I think that's also partially because it was much closer to us. This one, it's more in the distance. And the destruction is farther in, like he's farther through the swipe, so more of the debris is kind of shotgunning out. And I think I probably could have added a little bit more debris, but I am pretty happy with how it looks overall. Though I did notice again, and I might have mentioned this in the last Pokemon episode, that when I'm focused on doing the destruction in a drawing, I'm less focused on the actual design of the Titan. So this ends up being the only drawing in the episode where I actually do a character actively destroying something. In the other two, I focus more on the actual creature design, but I think this might have been my favorite drawing from the episode. It's hard to say, I really like the last drawing as well, but we'll get to that soon enough. Let's take a look at this one. Greg was more than happy to bring his kaiju buddy over to another dimension to help us out, and kaiju researcher, Matty McPatricks, was pretty excited to come and see Another World's Titans and help us figure out how to beat him. Of course, the main thing we needed was Grizzly Glam. That was the name Greg had given to his kaiju buddy. The beast was a 400-foot tall armored bear with some pretty funky colors to him, though not all of that was naturally occurring color. See, Greg had been an orphan whose parents had been killed in the first wave of kaiju attacks in my world. In the second wave, he was nearly killed himself by this big spider kaiju with some wicked sound attacks when Grizzly Glam showed up to fight it off. Ended up spotting Greg about to get stomped on and it saved him, set him in the fur on its upper back to keep him safe during the rest of the fight. Guess the thing could even understand a bit of English then too, because Greg was giving the thing callouts during the fight. After that, the two became pretty inseparable. Grizzly Glam even let Greg paint up his face and chest, making him look even more glamorous than he already did with his natural colors. See, Greg's old man had been a big fan of glam rock bands from the 70s and 80s, and Greg thought his kaiju friend already had a look like that and helped him lean into it. Even eventually got the guy this big armored custom top hat made that had cameras all around its rims that Greg could sit inside of on top of the kaiju's head to help him out Ratatouille style. Grizzly Glam had been pretty helpful in our world and was one of the tougher kaiju there, but I wasn't sure how he'd handle the next level titans in K005. We brought this team over to work with Monarch and sent Grizzly Glam right into Salt Lake City to take care of burning Grimvalp. The fight wasn't an easy one. Grimvalp scorched Grizzly so bad with his flames that the poor bear had practically no fur left by the end of that fight. But luckily his natural armor was durable enough to not let him get too hurt by the flames. But Grimvalp wasn't taking too much damage either. Grizzly did carve some massive holes into the fox till he was shredded to near fleshy tissue, but he just kept on coming like he wasn't hurt at all. It was only after the bear tore the fox's head off and chucked it out of the city that the flaming fox finally went down. It was a victory we were all pretty happy to see, but unfortunately Grizzly Glam didn't get any time to recover before another nightmare of a titan showed up ready to force Greg and his bear buddy into another round. Now, one thing I noticed in doing this episode and comparing it to the Pokemon Godzilla Monsters episodes is that while I do really like working with both FNAF and Pokemon was much better fuel for a Titans Godzilla Monster style episode. There's just more variety to pull from in Pokemon in terms of the shape and types of creatures, whereas most FNAF animatronics are like humanoid animals. Now, part of that is that I could have chosen different ones to work with, like I referenced DJ Music Man in this, and that guy has more of a spidery kind of look, so that could have made a cool spider kaiju titan kind of design. And if this does get a sequel, then I'll probably try and lean into that, pick some of the FNAF animatronics that have different sorts of shapes to them. But like I said, with Pokemon there is a lot more variety to pull from, so I think the variety in the Pokemon Godzilla Monsters episodes kind of reflects that. Still though, I am very happy with how all the drawings turned out in this. And with this one, like I said in the previous drawing, I wasn't going to focus on the environment and destruction as much. I mean, I still like how the environment looks in this, but I wanted to focus more on the actual design of the character. Though I will say, I don't know if this design is significantly better than the design of our Grim Foxy drawing at the beginning. I think the best creature design, even it might be my favorite drawing, might not be, not sure yet, is the last one in this episode that we'll get next. But still, I do really like how this one turns out as well. And I think it's funny, it almost has a little bit of a mech armor look to it, which is particularly funny because I've already done a mech armor version of Glamrock Freddy in my FNAF Animatronics as mech armor series. I mean, I did Freddy, then in the third episode repainted it to be Glamrock Freddy, but still. And for this one, I kind of leaned even more into looking up at the creature. I really like the perspective on this one. The buildings look a bit less like they're falling over, although I did put a little bit of damage and destruction on some of them. Also, I did consider referencing the fact that Benny Sharp, our mech maker character from Multiverse Tales, was the one to make the top hat on this character that this version of Greg uses, but then I realized it was going to get too convoluted with trying to reference the fact that Benny had made Five Nights at Freddy's mech armors in his world, and I couldn't figure out a way to write it in a simple way that wouldn't be too confusing for people that are new here and haven't seen those episodes or know what Multiverse Tales is, which is like the majority of episodes on this channel all tied together through the different narrators and stuff. I've got a Multiverse Tales Explained episode that you can check out if you want to know more. But anyway, this isn't my favorite design from the episode, but I am still very happy with how it turned out.
Quick interruption here to say that am I upside down? Okay, anyway. If you want the art from this episode as posters, they will be made available on my Teespring store and linked in the description. But of course, if you want hard copies of a whole bunch of my art, you might like my Monsters of the Multiverse art book. There's a whole bunch of kaiju drawings in there, dragons, aliens, demons, dinosaurs, tons of the best creatures that I've ever drawn on this channel. That'll be linked in the description as well. Now let's flip back over and get back into more art.
Jumping in to fight Grizzly and Greg right after their last fight was Akumban. That's the name we gave to this demonic rabbit-looking titan that was way too similar to a kaiju Grizzly had taken out back in our world. It was almost like this one was a bigger, scarier, almost zombified version of it, like it had been brought back from the dead just to take out Grizzly. I guess it's entirely possible that the demon who's making all these new titans show up in this world actually did just that, but hey, that's just a theory. Speaking of which, Greg and Grizzly probably would have been torn to shreds by this thing if Maddie hadn't come up with a way to take out this nightmare titan. They weren't faring too well at first. Like burning Grimvault, Akumban could take tons of damage without even noticing or being slowed down by it. The only way it seemed like they were going to beat this thing was if they tore it to pieces like they did with Grimvault, but this one was a lot stronger and better at avoiding attacks. Grizzly did manage to bite the thing right on the nose at one point, but even ripping its face off wasn't enough to take this thing out. And after that, the Titan got even more diligent about defending itself. It was looking like Grizzly was gonna go down before doing any real damage to this thing, until good old Matty McPatricks came up with a theory. Back in our world, this Titan and others like it had only ever attacked at night, and were always quick to retreat when the sun came out. We weren't near daytime yet, but if it wasn't a fan of light, we could get a bunch of spotlights on this thing, and maybe that'd distract it enough to give Grizzly the upper hand. Fast as we could, Monarch and the military dispatched helicopters with the highest powered lights they could find out to the city to shine on this thing from above. Akumban immediately got furious and tried chucking debris up at the choppers to knock him out, but it was too blinded to have good enough aim to get him. When it realized it wasn't going to get rid of the lights, it even started to retreat, giving Grizzly a perfect shot at the thing's back. He clawed at the thing's shoulders over and over as it was trying to run, and eventually ripped one of the beast's arms off and used its own twisted claws to impale the thing. It was a kinda nasty sight to see, but with all the lights on Akumban throwing it off its game, Grizzly and Greg were able to tear the Titan apart and finally stop it from getting back up. Not a pretty brawl to watch, but it got the job done. All thanks to another of good old McPatrick's theories. I'm gonna miss that guy when he's gone, but he sure has earned his retirement.
For any of you that might not know, Matpat, who created the Game Theory channel and a bunch of spin-off theorist channels and has probably made the most popular FNAF videos on YouTube, announced his retirement this week. So I figured it would be fun to create another variant of him in this video, like I did when I did a FNAF SCP back in my FNAF Animatronics as Different Monsters video. Anyway, now I mentioned DJ Music Man, and I actually had considered using him for the very last Titan in this episode, but I realized that I've never actually done a monstrous version of any variation of Bonnie. I have done a DJ Music Man Dragon in my third FNAF Dragons episode, but even in my FNAF Animatronics as Different Monsters episode, I've just never done a monstrous Bonnie, so I was like, alright, let's go with Nightmare Bonnie for this. And I'm very glad I did because I love how this one turned out. I think it looks super cool. I was even pulling a little bit of inspiration from my FNAF Zombies episodes for the torn up flesh because Nightmare Bonnie looks kind of withered and deteriorated and has bigger claws and teeth. I also wasn't entirely sure what color I should be doing Nightmare Bonnie, because regular Bonnie is more purple looking, but then the Nightmare version of Bonnie looked pretty blue, and I looked at some reference images where Nightmare Bonnie was blue, some it was purple, so I ended up using a gradient of a dark blue to purple, and I think that ends up making this thing look even cooler. And even though this drawing doesn't have any active destruction, I think the amount of movement in it from this thing just leaping up towards us / off to the side makes this both the design looks really cool, and the amount of active stuff happening in it makes it one of the best kaiju drawings I've done. And it's also the first landscape kaiju titan drawing I've done in my new sort of revamped version of this series, putting them in the Godzilla Monsters universe. I also added the moon into the background in this one with a bit of a cloud wisp going in front of it, inspired by my favorite drawing of last year, Lycanroc as a Titan, from the first Pokemon Godzilla Monsters episode, and I do think that helps elevate this one. I think it looks really cool. Not 100% sure if I like this as my favorite drawing from the episode or the first drawing of Grim Foxy, but either way, I'm just happy that there's a lot of cool stuff in this episode, and I hope you all like the final one.
If you enjoyed this, you might want to check out my 2 episodes of Pokemon Godzilla Monsters that I did recently, or maybe my 5 Nights at Freddy's Dragon series. I'd recommend starting with the 2nd episode, I'll link that one. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is the idea that if you understood how frequently people cope by projecting, you would stop taking anything personally. Everyone sees reality through a different lens based on their upbringing and the wiring of their brain, so in many cases, regardless of how you act, others are going to interpret how you've acted based on their view of the world. It's not an excuse to just assume you're doing everything right all the time, and if someone else is upset with you, they're wrong, but it's just a good reminder to know that the way someone treats you is often more of a reflection of what's inside them than what's inside you. I hope that's inspiring or helpful. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.